I still remember the morning I picked up my parents for what I thought would be the trip of a lifetime. My excitement was bubbling. I had booked the most luxurious, all-inclusive week in Europe, everything planned down to the last detail. But the moment I opened the car door, their smiles didn't reach their eyes. "Actually," my mother said casually, "we thought we'd take Sienna this time. She's been so stressed lately, she could use a break." I froze. Sienna, my 28-year-old sister, who hadn't held a steady job in 2 years, was suddenly more deserving of my meticulously planned gift than me, the one who had orchestrated the entire trip. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded, swallowing the sting while every ounce of pride and effort I had poured into this surprise seemed to vanish in a single, smiling sentence. Even as they drove off with her luggage, my heart thumped, not in despair, but in quiet, simmering determination. If this was how they were going to treat me, they were about to find out that I don't just plan trips, I plan comebacks. Before I go any further, I have to ask, have you ever given your all to someone, only to feel invisible when it mattered most? That was me, the one always planning, always giving, always careful, yet somehow overlooked. I'm Chloe, by the way. I've always been the organized, dependable one in the family, the one who takes care of everyone, keeps the peace, and sacrifices quietly. But that day, when my parents drove off with Sienna instead of me, something inside me shifted. I realized I couldn't just sit back and be ignored anymore. For as long as I could remember, I had been the responsible daughter. I managed the household schedules, handled family finances when needed, and made sure birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays were never anything less than perfect. My parents leaned on me not just for logistics, but for emotional stability. I gave my time, my energy, my planning, everything. And yet, somehow, my efforts were never fully acknowledged. Sienna, on the other hand, had always been the carefree one. She drifted from one short-term job to another, rarely committed to anything, and relied on the family for support. Somehow, that seemed to make her more in need of indulgence, according to my parents. I quietly watched as my life revolved around maintaining harmony, while she floated through it, receiving rewards I had painstakingly earned. I had a demanding career myself, a stable job I loved, but my parents seemed blind to the fact that my achievements required effort and discipline. They didn't see the late nights, the sacrifices, the careful planning that allowed our family to function smoothly. And yet, when the opportunity to enjoy a luxurious European vacation came along, they didn't hesitate to hand it to Sienna. That morning, as I drove home alone, I felt a swirl of frustration, humiliation, and disbelief. I knew my reaction couldn't be immediate, couldn't be loud. The situation required patience, observation, and a strategy one hadn't yet fully formed, but it was forming, slowly, quietly, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. In the days that followed, subtle signs began to appear everywhere, tiny reminders that my efforts were constantly being overlooked. My parents would call me for advice, then act on Sienna's suggestions instead. Invitations to family events were flexible, as if my presence was optional, but Sienna's were treated as mandatory. Even casual conversations carried a hint of bias, as if my opinions were background noise and Sienna's were the headline. At work, I noticed parallels too. Colleagues would pass over my ideas, giving credit to others for suggestions I had voiced first. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. It was the quiet kind of dismissal that makes you question yourself. Was I imagining it? Or was I really being sidelined in every corner of my life? I observed carefully, noting each slight, each pattern. Unlike Sienna, I didn't react impulsively. I didn't argue or demand recognition. I simply watched, stored the evidence in my mind, and felt a quiet fire ignite within me. This wasn't just about a trip anymore. It was about respect, recognition, and reclaiming what had always been mine. As weeks passed, the dismissals grew bolder. My parents would call to catch up after their trip, describing Europe in glowing detail, but always through Sienna's lens. Every story, every photo, every anecdote was filtered through her voice, as if I had never existed. "Chloe, you wouldn't have enjoyed the vineyards like Sienna did," my mother said one afternoon, casually, while showing me pictures of Sienna laughing under the Parisian sun. My father nodded, smiling as though my presence were irrelevant. The luxurious experiences I had painstakingly arranged for all of us had been repurposed to validate Sienna's leisure. Even strangers seemed to amplify it. Extended family who had once sought my guidance now gushed over Sienna's initiative in planning the trip, unaware that I had orchestrated everything. Social media posts celebrated her European adventure, tagging my parents, never me. Every overlooked contribution added weight to the humiliation, and yet, I remained quiet. Inside, a storm brewed. I didn't lash out. I didn't cry. I simply documented every slight, every instance of dismissal. This was no longer about a single trip. It was about patterns, privilege, and the invisible hierarchy that had been cemented in my family for far too long. And quietly, deliberately, I began to prepare. Despite my efforts to stay composed, the emotional toll was undeniable. Friends asked why I hadn't gone on the trip, and when I explained, their sympathy was polite but fleeting. They couldn't fully grasp the sting of being invisible in your own family. At home, Sienna would casually mention the exquisite meals, the private tours, the experiences she had enjoyed with mom and dad, as if I had no part in arranging them. There were moments of self-doubt, of wondering if I had overreacted, if perhaps I was imagining the slight. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I should just let it go, smile, and continue being the dutiful daughter. But deep down, I knew the truth. My contributions had been ignored, my planning stolen, and my parents had publicly elevated Sienna above me without consequence. I found myself withdrawing slightly, observing quietly rather than engaging. Each interaction became a mental audit, noting tone, gestures, choices of words, patterns of favoritism. I realized that staying silent was not weakness, it was strategic endurance. While Sienna and my parents reveled in temporary triumph, I was quietly learning, quietly strengthening, and quietly preparing for the moment when the balance would shift. Then came the day when it felt like I had lost completely. My parents hosted a small family gathering to show off Sienna's European adventure. Photos were projected on a big screen, champagne glasses clinked, and laughter echoed, all centered around Sienna. Friends and relatives praised her charm, her initiative, her ability to soak up the culture. I felt invisible, like a shadow in the room I had once filled with effort and love. Even my own suggestions for family trips or outings were brushed aside. "Chloe, Sienna's idea seems more fun," my father said casually, as if my input had no weight. The humiliation was compounded by the applause and smiles surrounding Sienna. Everyone seemed to see her as the star, the achiever, the one who deserved attention. In that moment, I allowed myself the illusion of defeat. Maybe my parents would never recognize my contributions. Maybe Sienna would always overshadow me. But even as the applause rang in my ears, I held on to a silent truth: this was only the surface. Beneath the layers of dismissal and applause, I was gathering every detail, every slight, every misstep. And the day of reckoning was quietly approaching. After the gathering, I retreated into quiet observation. I didn't argue, I didn't complain, and I certainly didn't let anyone see the fire burning inside me. Instead, I watched closely, my parents' routines, Sienna's casual arrogance, the little cracks in their judgment. I began keeping a private journal, noting every detail of what happened during the trip, expenses, decisions, moments where my planning had been used or ignored. I documented every compliment Sienna received that rightfully belonged to me. Each note fueled my determination rather than despair. I understood that patience was my ally. I could endure the humiliation, observe the patterns, and wait for the right moment. The quiet endurance wasn't passive, it was preparation. While they celebrated the surface, I was quietly building the leverage that would ensure that when the time came, the balance would tip irrevocably in my favor. As the weeks turned into months, patterns became undeniable. Every family decision seemed to favor Sienna. Every compliment, every indulgence, every small reward was funneled toward her, as if my existence were optional. But the more I observed, the more clarity emerged. I realized this wasn't random. It was habitual, a cycle my parents had unconsciously established and reinforced. They equated Sienna's lack of responsibility with innocence and entitlement, while my reliability had somehow become invisible. But patterns are predictable, and predictability is power. I began mapping out every moment, every reaction, every choice, turning their casual favoritism into a blueprint I could use. Recognition brought a strange calm. No longer confused, no longer humiliated in uncertainty, I could see the system clearly. And in seeing it, I realized that control wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, if I played my moves carefully and deliberately. While everyone assumed Sienna's trip had been flawless and my parents' judgment unquestionable, I quietly collected evidence of every misstep. I had emails proving I booked flights, hotels, and exclusive tours. I had receipts showing the expenses I had personally covered. I even saved screenshots of messages where my parents thanked me for the arrangements, but then handed Sienna the credit. I knew my advantage was invisible to them. They believed they had made all the decisions, orchestrated the trip, and chosen the deserving daughter. They had no idea that every luxurious moment, every detail they bragged about publicly, had originated from me. I also had witnesses, friends who knew my role in the planning and who would quietly corroborate my story if needed. Every small oversight, every unintentional boast Sienna made, became a thread I could later pull to unravel the public narrative. This hidden advantage was exhilarating. Unlike the frustration and humiliation I had endured, this power was real, concrete, and undeniable. The audience, my careful observation and documentation, was my secret weapon, and the moment of revelation was quietly building, like a symphony preparing for its crescendo. With the hidden advantage securely documented, I noticed a subtle change within myself. The longing for validation, the need for recognition, began to fade. I realized I didn't need my parents' approval or Sienna's envy to feel worthy. My power wasn't loud or dramatic, it was composed, measured, undeniable. I started moving through my days with quiet confidence. I no longer felt the sting of each slight because I understood its temporary nature. The patterns I had recognized, the documentation I had gathered, and the patience I had cultivated gave me a calm certainty. My worth wasn't defined by others' perceptions, it was defined by what I knew to be true. Even when Sienna bragged about some detail or my parents shared stories that ignored my contributions, I remained composed. No reaction, no argument, just silent observation. In this internal transformation, I had discovered my greatest strength, restraint. And restraint, wielded wisely, would ensure that when the moment came, justice would not only be served but undeniable. Now, I moved into the most crucial phase, measured, deliberate preparation. Every document, every receipt, every message and photo was organized into a timeline. I noted the exact roles Sienna and my parents had played and how the public and family perceived each moment. Nothing was left to chance. I also planned the narrative. I knew the moment of revelation had to be precise, undeniable, and public enough to shift perception without me ever appearing vengeful or petty. The power of timing was now my ally. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was creating a strategy that would convert humiliation into authority. I even anticipated counterarguments. If my parents claimed Sienna deserved the trip, I had evidence showing that I had arranged and funded every aspect. If Sienna boasted or misrepresented her role, I had witnesses ready to quietly confirm the truth. Every possible scenario had a solution, every move calculated. This was no longer about jealousy or hurt, it was about rightful acknowledgement and restoring balance. I had endured humiliation, mastered patience, gathered leverage, and transformed internally. Now, the stage was set. The moment of quiet control, of undeniable reversal, was approaching, and I would enter it poised, composed, and unstoppable. The perfect opportunity arrived during a family dinner at a restaurant my parents had always favored. Sienna arrived, radiant from her European adventure, brimming with stories she had spun to make herself the center of attention. My parents beamed proudly, completely unaware that I had arrived armed not with anger, but with undeniable evidence. I entered quietly, observed the room, and let my presence settle naturally. No dramatic entrances, no harsh words. I simply smiled and listened as Sienna recounted every detail of her trip. Each exaggeration, each misstatement, each accidental boast was a thread I had catalogued in my mind. The contrast between the arrogant confidence of Sienna and my calm composure was subtle but powerful. While she spoke loudly to impress, I remained poised, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but in reality, every eye would soon see the truth. The stage was set, the arena of humiliation had become the arena of control. As the dinner continued, Sienna grew bolder. She recounted stories of exclusive tours, expensive dinners, and private experiences as though she had orchestrated them herself. My parents nodded approvingly, praising her initiative and planning skills. Each word, each gesture, each boast was recorded silently in my mind. She didn't realize her confidence was becoming her own trap. The more she claimed credit, the clearer the pattern became, not just for me, but for anyone who looked closely. Every exaggeration contradicted documented facts, flight bookings, hotel reservations, and itinerary confirmations, all of which bore my name. Every luxurious experience she bragged about had been arranged, funded, and executed by me. Even small social interactions worked in my favor. Sienna casually mentioned choices my parents had made on the trip, decisions I had guided every step of the way. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that I had every detail, every proof, every witness ready. And with each overreach, she unwittingly laid the foundation for her own public unraveling. By the end of the evening, Sienna had done all the work for me. All that remained was to let the facts speak for themselves. The moment arrived naturally. During dessert, I casually placed a folder in front of my parents and Sienna, labeled simply, Europe Trip Documentation. Curiosity sparked. My mother asked what it was. I smiled calmly and said, just a little recap of how the trip came together, thought it would be nice to see everything in one place. One by one, I presented flight confirmations, hotel bookings, private tour receipts, and even the text messages where I had coordinated every detail. Each page highlighted my role, my effort, and my contribution. Sienna squirmed as her stories began to unravel, her exaggerated claims silently contradicted by documented proof. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply let the facts speak. My parents' expressions shifted from pride in Sienna to astonishment and quiet shame as they realized the truth. The luxurious trip they had been praising as Sienna's achievement had been entirely orchestrated by me. Guests at the table leaned in, witnessing the silent power play. Sienna tried to interrupt, tried to explain, tried to charm, but it was too late. The truth was concrete, undeniable, and perfectly timed. In that quiet, composed moment, I had transformed humiliation into authority, invisibility into recognition. The aftermath was immediate, though subtle. Sienna, once confident and self-assured, shrank under the weight of undeniable evidence. Her boastful demeanor crumbled as friends and family quietly connected the dots. Each social media post, every conversation, now highlighted her exaggeration rather than my oversight. My parents, initially speechless, exchanged glances filled with regret. They had elevated Sienna without realizing the truth, and now the recognition they had withheld from me was unavoidable. Compliments, questions, and attention naturally shifted back to me. I wasn't seeking revenge, I didn't gloat. The balance had simply restored itself. Even Sienna, though embarrassed, had no choice but to acknowledge reality. The collapse wasn't loud or humiliating, it was a quiet, inevitable consequence of arrogance and oversight. Justice had been served, and it was irreversible. In this public yet composed reversal, my patience, preparation, and restraint spoke louder than any argument ever could. In the days that followed, the family dynamic shifted subtly but permanently. My parents began consulting me for decisions they had once handed over to Sienna. Invitations, celebrations, and even casual outings reflected a newfound respect. Sienna, though still present, no longer monopolized attention or claimed credit for achievements she hadn't earned. Friends who had witnessed the trip, and even colleagues who knew my planning skills, reached out to acknowledge my contributions. The quiet power I had cultivated was now visible in social interactions. I hadn't sought revenge through humiliation, instead, I had used strategy, evidence, and patience to correct the narrative. The consequences were social and reputational, legal action wasn't necessary, because truth, timing, and calm authority were enough to restore balance. For the first time, I felt the full weight of respect I had earned silently for years, and it was profoundly satisfying. Looking back, I realized that dignity and patience are more powerful than anger or impulsive retaliation. I didn't need to shout, argue, or humiliate anyone to claim what was rightfully mine. By observing quietly, documenting thoroughly, and acting strategically, I transformed a moment of betrayal into a lasting lesson in respect and recognition. Sienna learned that arrogance without accountability carries its own consequences. My parents learned that true effort deserves acknowledgement. And I learned that self-worth isn't defined by others' perceptions, it's defined by one's own clarity, patience, and quiet strength. In the end, the luxurious trip I had gifted became more than a vacation, it became a testament to strategy, resilience, and the power of composed justice. I had turned invisibility into recognition, and humiliation into a triumph that no one could deny.